So thanks once again for tuning in, and my talk is on understory vegetation dynamics. This is my interest that flows all the way back from my graduate studies. And I now have my undergraduate student, Kiara, who took a crack at the data, and my collaborator, Dr. Ellen McDonald at the University of Alberta. So vertical stratification, as we know it, how the forest is structured, is a characteristic, I call it, of many productive forests. So you go into productive forests, sure to see the vertical layering in terms of the forest structure. And this layering or stratification creates a condition of resource limitation in the forest understory. So here we can have a distinct layer of the canopy trees, and then we can have some canopy trees or sub-canopy tree layer. These are trees that are just co-dominating or just below the upper canopy trees, biding their time to become the dominant trees later in succession. And then we move down the layer, we have the shrub layer, the herbaceous layer, and the little ones on the forest floor, we find the bryophytes and the lichens. Now, this stratification, as I mentioned, causes resource limitation in the understory. So imagine light penetrating to the canopy will be mostly intercepted by the upper canopy trees, more so also by the sub-canopy trees. And by the time it reaches the understory, the light is very much reduced in quality, and the understory layers also attenuate light that reaches the forest floor. So there is a whole scenario of resource limitation, not only light, can also talk about through fall, water coming through to the canopy will be intercepted mostly by the upper canopy trees and slowly released to reach the understory. So we have a condition of resource limitations. And as I also mentioned, the interactions between the various forest vegetation layers play an important role in structuring the understory plant communities. Now, my emphasis is on the understory plant communities. Their role in the forest ecosystem cannot be overemphasized. Roles in nutrient cycling, habitat provision, we've been regulating forest succession and whatnot. Now, if others have even called them the ecosystem, forest ecosystem drivers, call them the engineers of the forest ecosystem. So that means that's where it is happening, the forest understory. So to get a hang of what's happening in your forest, focus on the understory. What are the interactions between the understory can have important consequences for forest functioning. And we look in the understory again, looking at the resource limitations imposed by the layering or the upper canopy. You can consider the shrub layer species, the herb layer species. They like the light. They like unshaded conditions, so they can grow fast and tall. Unlike the bryophytes and lichens, the little ones on the forest floor, they want some shadier, cooler microsite or habitat where they also do well. So what mechanisms help plants to coexist? Are they coexisting? You can look in the mechanisms of coexistence. You can talk about the niche theory, niche partitioning, how they partition resources and whatnot. What I'm interested in is mostly about the competition or facilitation. So in these two photos here, what's happening? Are they competing? You can see the understory strifling, the conifer sapling here. You can also see the others where they seem to be all growing together nicely. So what's happening? Are they really competing, or they are facilitating, as in they're all enjoying it together or helping each other grow? So my question is, how do the abundance or richness of one vegetation layer affects those of subsequent vegetation layers? And can also throw in another factor. So can look at a forest ecosystem or a forest stand which has a closed canopy. So closed canopy conditions imposes resource limitations in the understory. So light here might be limiting or very scanty in the understory compared to open canopy conditions. So here, if we do some partial curtains, there will be more space, more light for understory plants to coexist. We contrast that with clear curtain where light is not limiting, there is enough space. And are they going to grow together? Are they going to compete for resources? Yes, we can consider all those scenarios. Others may outgrow others, outcompete others, but we may expect conditions in clear cuts may help foster facilitation among understory plants, unlike under closed canopy conditions where limiting resources may endanger or engender competition among plants. So how will canopy removal influence the nature of the interactions among understory plants? My emphasis is on the nature of the interactions. Are they competing? Are they facilitating each other? And at what points or what degree, at what point in time? So I take advantage of the forest harvest experiments from the ecosystem management emulating natural disturbance, EMEND, acronym EMEND experiment. EMEND is located in northern Alberta in Canada, and it's one of the largest forest manipulative experiments forest ecosystem ongoing. It's about close to 8,000 hectares in total area. And there are a suite of treatments. So they have the dispersed retention, variable retention, harvesting treatments. There are some burn treatment with some slash and aggregate retention. My focus here is on the variable retention treatment. So clear cuts, where conventionally we cut everything, but by policy we are required to leave about 2% of the original forests in terms of biomass or composition. And then we have 10%, 20%, 50%, 75%. We contrast that with the uncut control. So we have a whole gradient of harvest intensification. And there are about 4 major forest types: deciduous dominated, conifer dominated, and mixed wood, which will be conifer plus deciduous broadleaves in relatively equal proportion. So for the understory vegetation, I consider the shrub layer species, and the shrub layer species could include tree species or supplants. So herbaceous layer, shrub layer, tall shrubs, low shrubs. For tree species and all those, I considered 5 centimeters diameter, less than 5 centimeters diameter at 1.3 height. So most people consider the understory below 2 meters. Others go as far as 5 meters, but I consider 1.3 meters height, less than 5 centimeters for shrub layer species. And the herbaceous layer species include forbs, graminoids, and the forest floor counterparts, bryophytes and lichens. For lichens, we did not have sufficient data that are included for this specific analysis. And these measurements are repeated over time. So we have repeated measurements because these are sampled in permanent sample plots. There are about 6 sampling plots per compartment. Compartment is about 10 hectare in size. And the post-harvest years or post-sampling years, 2001, 2004, latest is about 2017. So we have a gradient in time as well, 3 years, 6 years, 11 years, 17 years post-harvest. And I analyzed this, or we looked at this using path analysis. Path analysis, if you're familiar with, is synonymous to structural equation modeling. And the best part is it can model some direct and indirect effects. And the total effect will be a combination of the direct and the total effect. So by direct and indirect effect, here's an example. I considered a hierarchical interaction, like a hierarchy. The tall shrub layer can have the low shrub, get to the herbaceous layer, group by forb, graminoid, and then to the forest floor, verified. So a direct effect here could be tall shrub directly influencing the graminoid, tall shrubs directly influencing bryophytes. So if you consider the indirect effect of tall shrub on bryophytes, could be through tall shrub mediated through its effect on graminoids, or its effect on forb, or even low shrub cover. So for these individual path models that we built, we assess the goodness of fit, how reliable was the fit. And in some cases, for model fitting purposes, the interaction between tall shrub and low shrub was omitted. In terms of results, here I'm presenting a case in the mixed wood forest, which is dominated by aspen and spruce, mostly white spruce. So mixed wood stand has intermediate conditions. And what happens in terms of species abundance, I'm also presenting a suite, just a subset of the suite of harvest treatments. I'm contrasting the control, the 50% retention, and the clear cut. Now, the ones shaded in green are the positive interactions, which suggestive of facilitation, and the one shaded in red are the negative interactions or the competitive interactions. And what do we see? See mostly competitive, facilitative interactions, positive interactions between the shrubs and the forbs. So our shrub layer and herbaceous layer species were mostly facilitating each other, which was great news. So they're coexisting, they're not competing. And we can also see the negative interactions, so low shrubs and graminoids or herbaceous layer on bryophytes in particular. So for shrubs that we highlight in this graph, it mostly could be due to the chemical inhibition of shrub litter on the bryophytes. That's very well documented. So that could be explaining the negative interactions that we are seeing. Again, I see the trends were very inconsistent through time. So we can find here in the clear cuts at 3 years post-harvest, there is no detectable significant interaction. Why so? Are they not responding? Is everybody happy, or they are shocked, or it's a lagged effect? So by 3 years, 6 years post-harvest, you can see strong signals of the facilitative interactions between the shrub layer species and the herbaceous layer species. By 11 years, 17 years post-harvest, the signal of herbaceous, so graminoid and bryophyte, for example, is a significant negative interactions. It could be that they are being outcompeted for space through time. And we look at species richness. Frankly, we weren't expecting much because interactions are mostly strongly, the signals are captured strongly with species abundance, not so for species richness. And we see fewer interactions. But then again, if you look up here in the control treatment, there's negative interactions between the tall shrubs and the graminoids. These are mixed wood stands, about 150 years plus at the time of harvesting.
Sorry, Samuel, you have a 1 minute warning. Just
Sure.
1 minute at that time. Sorry.
So we would not expect much graminoids in these closed canopy conditions, but you look at the clear cuts, we see mostly facilitative interactions between the forbs, the bryophytes. So still space through time, space, room for interactions. So in conclusion, the trends we see pretty much highlight what we know and what we all expect. Understory plant communities and their interactions are highly dynamic. They change over time. And it's a mix of both facilitative and competitive interactions. So what we do in terms of ecological considerations will be that other factors, and rightly so, well beyond the light limitations. So we could consider microsites, chemical inhibition, and others shape or structure the understory species interactions. Well, might be time to modify the way we harvest, the method and severity in order to allow more species to coexist. Could be looking at creating favorable microsites or microclimate conditions, especially for the bryophytes, leave some structures on the ground, do some variable spacing, aggregate retention and the like to help our plant communities. And I'll leave you with this beautiful shot of the immense experiment, and there's a website if you're interested, you can talk more about. So thanks for my short little presentation, and I'm sure we can talk more if there is time.
I am John, and today I'm going to present one of the studies we have done in the Island Montreal biodiversity experiment with trees. This presentation is about the long-term diversity effects on tree productivity over the first 11 years of the experiment. Okay, so let's start. Okay, sorry. Okay, now. So, as you know, during the last decades, analyzing the possible consequences of the biodiversity loss on the functioning of different ecosystems has received a lot of attention, right? In particular, in forest ecosystem, hundreds of studies looking into the effects of diversity on forest productivity have been published, all leading to the general consensus that more diversity promotes, on average, higher levels of productivity. However, among all these studies, there are important divergences in the strength of these diversity effects, with some of them even reporting negligible or negative effects. Some studies demonstrated that complex interactions between environmental factors and forest structure can explain part of these variations across space. However, much less is known about the temporal dynamics of these relationships over time, along with forest development. In particular, diversity effects are thought to be especially important on the early stage of stand development, when competition for light and other essential resources is the major driver that determines forest structure and functioning, right? This topic could be very important from a conservation or even management perspective, because now with all this with the increased interest on afforestation and reforestation programs to fight global changes, actually it is essential to better understand the role of diversity in these young developing communities, along with forest development, right? Because they shape the forest structure, the future forest structure and functioning. So in order to explain these diversity effects, two different mechanisms has been proposed. First, we have complementarity effects, which is very intuitive. It basically states that if we mix species with contrasting functional traits, trees can use resources more efficiently and at the same time reduce the competition for these resources. And second, we have selection effects, right? That states that the domination of one or few species with a specific set of functional traits drive communities' productivity. So how can these two mechanisms drive net diversity effects over time during forest development? So, during the first years after forest establishment, essential resources are normally abundant, fulfilling trees' requirements to grow and survive. Consequently, during these first years, competition among trees are minimal. This reduces the likelihood of complementarity effects and might increase the probability of sampling dominant high productive species that drives community productivity. However, as stands developed, trees progressively expand their crowns, which gradually intensifies competition for resources and growing space. This might potentially increase the influence of complementarity because positive biotic interactions are expected to emerge under more stressful conditions. Here, based on this high competition for resources and growing space. So the objective of this study is to analyze the diversity effects on productivity and the underlying mechanisms over time during the early stage of stand development. We hypothesize that the strength of this diversity effects on productivity increases with stand development driven mainly by increases in complementarity effect as competition for resources intensifies. We also expect that functional diversity and identity explain this net diversity effect on productivity over time. As I said before at the beginning, this study was conducted in the Iden Montreal biodiversity experiment with trees. This experiment includes monocultures of 12 native species. Then we have 14 combinations of 2 species, 10 combinations of 4 species, and a mixture including the 12 species. Then its community was replicated 4 times in a randomized block design, okay? So basically what we do in this kind of experiment is just comparing the performance or productivity, in this case, of every mixture against the respective monocultures. In this way, we are able to quantify empirically the net diversity effects and also the underlying mechanisms, complementarity and selection. So the results of this study show a non-linear dynamic of diversity effects on productivity during the early stages of stand development that became significantly positive 9 years after the establishment of the experiment. As we can see in this figure, the strengthening of the diversity effects since year 5, year 6, more or less, was driven mainly by increases in complementarity effects as stands developed. While during the first years, negative selection effects seem to be more important, driving the overall net diversity effects, although they were not significant. The trend we observe here might be explained by the fact that, as we can see now, you know, it takes several years before trees reach certain size where they begin to compete for limited resources and grow in space, and where contrasting architectural and physiological traits allow mixtures to benefit from resource needs partitioning. Indeed, we observed that mixtures mixing species with contrasting resource use strategies, fast and slow growth strategy, increased mixtures over yielding during the first decade of stand development, while mixtures mixing species with similar resource use strategies showed similar productivity to the respective monocultures, except for the last year when they overall over yielded a bit. So through differences in their growth patterns during stand development, you know, contrasting species can use different canopy positions, which reduces competition and allow to capture more light at the community level. Also, as competition for light reduces, trees might invest more fixed carbon towards the development of lateral branches, increasing their crown size. In this regard, vertical stratification and crown plasticity might be 2 different mechanisms driving the complementarity effects, or the positive complementarity effects we observed in this study. We also observed that functional identity was an important driver of the net diversity effects over time. We found that the dominance by deciduous early successional and fast developing species increased mixtures productivity during the first decade of stand development. These results suggest that the complementarity effects we measured might be also driven by a species with a specific set of functional traits that are able to take advantage of these diverse conditions when growing in mixtures, leading to over yield at the community level. In particular, probably the effective light acquisition of these species allow them to grow faster when growing in mixtures, dominate the canopy space, and those leading to over yield at the community level, as I said. So to conclude with this presentation, this study shows that first, diversity effects on productivity increases progressively during the early stages of stand development, driven by gradual increases of complementarity. This pattern seems to be directly related to the progression into the canopy closure and the subsequent self-thinning process of the stand development, where increasing competition for the limited resources and growing space promotes this positive complementarity effect, driving the overall net diversity effect. Moreover, our study highlights that mixtures performance relative to the respective monoculture is affected by both functional diversity and identity. We saw that mixing species with contrasting resource use strategies and the dominance of deciduous fast developing species promote this positive diversity effect on productivity. So thank you very much. That's all from my side. And in case you are interested in the study, I left here the citation of the study. So in case you are more interested, you can go and check. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate everyone being here virtually. Unfortunately, I think we all probably wish we were in person, but that's not happening yet. So today, I want to talk about some work that my collaborators and I, both here at the Pacific Northwest Research Station, as well as Oregon State, have been taking on to try and link mortality modeling at individual and plot scales to the broader vulnerability across landscapes of trees to different stressors. So, what's the significance of tree mortality? Forests support a whole bunch of values that we care about: timber, water resources, recreation, carbon storage, wildlife, biodiversity, and the list goes on. And tree mortality is of course a fundamental part of the way that forest ecosystems function, right? That trees don't live forever, so clearly at some point they have to die, and many agents are responsible for that. It could be insect, disease, wind, fire, harvesting, a lot of things. And the diversity of mechanisms that really drive mortality, but also the sort of diversity of forest ecosystems across the landscape result in very diverse set of patterns of mortality, both in space and time. And so on the left here, I've just thrown out some different images of different types of mortality events, whether it's wildfire or drought or insect and disease or timber harvesting. Different sorts of mortality can really play out, can be these broad scale impacts, but also we just have a lot of mortality that happens just in the course of forest dynamics, of forest developing and changing through time. And really it comes down to there's a complex chain of events with drivers operating at a variety of scales and as a consequence, also having impacts at a variety of scales. But it's important to note with trees that not all trees respond the same way, right? That's obvious to us as forest ecologists. So mortality, we could think of it likely varies among species, but also among tree sizes for different reasons, right? Below, I have just a conceptual figure showing some different types of relationships between mortality and tree size. Mortality on the probability on the y-axis, tree size on the x-axis that are common in the literature, increasing mortality probability with tree size decreasing. Bimodal patterns, a variety of things. But when it comes also to thinking about how stressors, things like competition or moisture limitation might impact trees, we can also think that itself would also vary among not just tree species, but tree sizes, right? We could have situations where stress increases mortality in small trees. And so think about, of course, competition for light in young for young trees. We could think about elevated mortality under stress for large trees. Certain insects and diseases are more likely to impact large trees than small trees. Or we might see increases across the gamut of sizes. And so today, really what I'm going to talk about is thinking about, where are trees vulnerable to mortality and particularly in landscapes of Eastern Washington and Oregon, USA is where this study is focused on, and really trying to break that apart both into the sensitivity. So what are the factors that explain tree mortality at the plot scale, but also exposure, where are trees of different sizes, different species located, and how that sort of couples with that sensitivity to set up vulnerability. And really, this is going to be sort of a quick dive into an empirical framework we're developing to map mortality vulnerability across landscapes. This is the general framework. For this talk, the initial testing we're doing is in Eastern Oregon Cascades. So it's highlighted in the upper right. It's an area that's generally, for our region, somewhat drier forests than west of the Cascades, which are kind of those temperate rainforest ecosystems. And how this framework is set up is we build in the upper left, we build statistical models of tree mortality based on tree sizes, but also things like basal area, quadratic mean diameter, which is the average size of tree in the stand, topographic position index, which is a measure of topographic position locally, as well as climatic water deficit. We also have maps of those variables, and so we can use the statistical models plus the maps to create maps of mortality probability. And we can then also marry that with maps of the density or basal area of different tree sizes by species, basically multiplying the trees per hectare we have predicted for an individual 30-meter pixel. This is all based on Landsat, by our predicted mortality probability to get what we're calling mapped mortality vulnerability, which is essentially a predicted sort of number of trees or basal area of trees we might expect to die on an annual basis. So the mortality modeling, the sensitivity part of it, what we wanted to do was we were using forest inventory data on National Forest System lands in Eastern Oregon and Washington. This was called the Continuous Vegetation Survey. It's sort of like forest inventory analysis for those familiar with that inventory, but a little bit different. And we looked at mortality as a function of basal area and quadratic mean diameter, two stand structure variables, topography, and climate. And we did this for 6 different size class bins. And we piloted this on 6 common species in Eastern Oregon and Washington: white fir, grand fir, subalpine fir, western larch, ponderosa pine, and Douglas fir. And what you end up with after the modeling is this is a partial dependence plot here on the right, showing the basal area on the x-axis, the annual probability of mortality on the y-axis for trees in different size classes. And so we can see the black dots here are the smallest size class, 2.5 to about 7.5 centimeters. The open circles, these sort of fuchsia, are the largest trees, basically everything above 81.28 centimeters. And for the purposes of this talk, we also, eventually I'll have a summary table that shows what we call positive and negative effects, and that's based on 90% confidence intervals of effects that are non-zero, essentially. And here it's demarcated by a red line for the small trees and a purple line for some of the larger trees. So I want to throw through one example for one species, Douglas fir, which is our most common species in Oregon and Washington. And what we found, so in terms of the sensitivity. So on the left, from left to right, we have basal area, quadratic mean diameter, which is essentially the average size of trees, and those are both log scaled. Topographic position index, negative values are essentially riparian areas, positive values are up on the slopes or ridges, and then climatic water deficit on the right. So larger values are where AET and PET are most different, which implies you know, a lack of water. So what do we see? Well, for basal area and quadratic mean diameter, it looks like the sensitivities really shift as we change size classes. You know, particularly if look over here on the right with climatic water deficit, the big trees have a substantial increase in mortality as we get to drier environments, whereas the smaller trees, these black and red symbols, are pretty flat across that window. For TPI, the topographic position index, it's interesting. In most cases, there is somewhat of a pattern of a decrease, though it's a little bit muddled here, which is interesting to say that mortality is a bit lower in those upper parts of the landscape as opposed to down in the wetter parts of the landscape, which is kind of interesting. And then for tree size, the quadratic mean diameter, it's sort of all over the place. But really, to avoid too much detail here, I sort of summarized the positive and negative effects we have by variable and sort of broadly group them by types of processes, whether competition, climatic moisture, or topographic moisture. And what we see is, for small trees, we had a lot of positive effects of basal area and QMD. So as stand density gets greater, quadratic mean diameter increases, so tree sizes increase, small tree mortality tended to increase, which makes sense from a light competition point of view. For moisture, we saw that small trees, there was a negative effect of climatic water deficit on mortality, but for large trees, there tended to be more of a positive effect for more species. And then for topographic position index, there wasn't a clear one direction or the other for larger small trees, but about half the species, there did seem to be some topographic constraint, so maybe some topographic escape from mortality agents or stressful conditions. So we have these mortality models, again, that I've just blown through very quickly. But the point is that we, again, marry these with maps of the covariates we use in the models to map probability of mortality, and then to map this vulnerability, mapped mortality vulnerability that we generate. And that's really what I want to focus on for the rest of this talk. And to highlight, I'm zooming in on part of the landscape because it's kind of characteristic of what we saw. But generally, if we look at this, you know, trees per hectare, this mortality vulnerability is a function of kind of estimated trees per hectare per year that we might see die. You know, the highest numbers are in this, and I should note, this is ponderosa pine in a small area. From the leftmost are smaller trees, and it gets bigger as we go to the right. So lots of red on the left-hand side, right? There's higher numbers of trees potentially dying, probability, higher estimated number that should die in the smaller trees, and then it becomes very blue as you go to the right. So most of the trees dying that have a risk of dying are in the smaller diameter classes, but still there are interesting spatial patterns that you can see cropping out in these maps. But if instead of trees per hectare, we look at maybe a basal area based mortality measure or vulnerability, we see some quite different patterns. And we see some really interesting spatial patterns that pop out in terms of this vulnerability. So it's a different pattern than total trees per hectare, but also we see things like, well, there are areas where compared to the area around it, it has this higher vulnerability, implying that maybe in some cases we have small to mid-sized tree mortality is a greater concern, whereas other areas, perhaps it's medium to large trees that are of greater concern. And this really, I think, implies that we may have these different syndromes of potential mortality and vulnerability on the landscape, and managers would address those conditions differently, right? They might have different tools for thinking about small versus large trees, right? The small trees were impacted by basal area, so maybe thinning those stands out would help, whereas the large trees, that may not be the case depending on the species. there's interactive influences. Tree species and size clearly matters in our analysis, and altered mortality sensitivity. And when you pair that with the patterns of where the trees are, we see that those patterns of trees at risk versus maybe the ecosystem level effect, the basal area mortality vulnerability might be quite different. And we really want to engage with managers to try and develop guidance for how to use these layers to guide management. So with that, thank my funding sources and thank you all for listening.
I'm Benjamin Spee from the University of Idaho, and I'm going to talk about a study that I've done here about aspen. It's a nice long title, but specifically what we were looking at was aspen's ability to persist and create these and form stable stands based on moisture regimes. And so we did that with a comparison of riparian and non-riparian aspen. Okay, so a little bit of background. If you're not familiar with aspen, it is a pretty interesting organism, and it is considered an important cover type, especially in the Western United States, because it forms these pretty nice, large, attractive, contiguous stands, which kind of breaks up the landscape and kind of creates its own little ecosystem. We're going to focus primarily on the regeneration of aspen in this talk, and just a quick background. Regeneration is primarily considered to be caused by sprouting from the rootstock, which means that most of these stands, when you see large aspen stands, they're usually clonal. So usually within these stands, you'll see smaller patches, and each one of these patches very often is usually one clone, meaning that the entire stand is made up of 2 to 3 large clones, and on occasion, smaller little pockets of genetically unique individuals. Sprouting in between different types of stands, growing in different conditions, can be variable. Some stands actually require the mature stems to be top-killed to stimulate the sprouting from the rootstock. Okay, so that's caused us to cause researchers to put aspen into 2 different functional groups. One is considered stable. So a stable aspen stand is self-replacing in the absence of disturbance. It doesn't require any kind of top kill. You see that you can have these large contiguous mature stems, and then there's also a regeneration layer that is coming up and replacing the canopy as it dies off. However, in seral stands, so stands that require some form of disturbance, usually fire, because aspen, not a very long-lived species and not a very good competitor, especially around conifers. So conifers very often will kind of invade these stands and over time shade out the regeneration and take over the stand. And then other stands that even aren't susceptible to conifer initiation or conifer encroachment still are poor sprouters, so they require some kind of disturbance such as beaver or fire or even other land use such as timber harvest to kill the mature stems to stimulate the sprouting from the rootstock. Okay. Now, people have been a little bit worried about aspen over the last few decades because of several threats to their persistence and presence in the landscape. One of the big ones is altered disturbance regimes, so fire suppression primarily, and that's what's caused the overtaking of some of these stands by competitive shrubs and conifers, but also climate change, increased temperature, increased drought. It's caused mortality in the overstory, but without stimulating regeneration at the lower level. And then last is heavy ungulate browsing. So increased population of elk and deer kind of suppresses the stimulation at the source. Okay, this talk I'm going to focus primarily on the climate change factors, mostly temperature and moisture stress, and really honestly, moisture stress. Okay, so why climate change and what's the issue? Well, most researchers kind of theorize that, yes, this increase in temperature and drought has caused already a reduction in aspen's range and persistence, and some models, such as this one that I took from Refelt, has shown that in conservative estimates, we're probably looking at a loss of 30 to 40% of aspen's range, and in some of the most extreme cases, it may be as bad as 70 to 90%. So, drought. we thought it'd be interesting to kind of investigate these differences in moisture stress and how they are affecting aspen mortality and aspen regeneration. So many of these studies kind of show that moisture stress specifically is the main inciting factor for a lot of these issues that we're seeing with aspen. If you haven't heard of sudden aspen decline or sudden aspen dieback, it is a disease that is characterized by rapid dieback of the mature stock with no regeneration coming in to replace the stand. And it's been, everybody's kind of been pointing the finger lately at drought and moisture stress as being the inciting factor on that. And then that kind of weakens the stock and makes it more susceptible to secondary agents and pathogens. But even in stands that aren't considered affected by SAD, you're still seeing increased mortality, reduced regeneration, and this is happening in stable and cereal stands. Okay. However, when you're talking about mortality and regeneration of aspen, just like with most other tree species, their persistence is actually contingent on a lot of different interacting factors, right? You have differences in stand structure, local disturbance regimes, context, location, and scale. So we kind of want to zoom in on this idea of context and location. And we want to say, okay, well, the easiest way to kind of look at this is to look at riparian aspen stands or aspen growing in areas that are not moisture limited. So growing along perennial streams where they have a consistent water source throughout the growing season versus stands that are growing in upland zones that require an input of precipitation or snow melt. And we kind of theorize that these riparian zones will show elevated levels or higher levels of regeneration and thus a higher level of persistence and stability relative to the upland stands. And in this way, riparian zones may in the future kind of create a type of refugia for aspen. Okay, so essentially our main hypothesis is, yes, riparian zones provide an ecological context that promotes higher levels of regeneration. And based on that, you're going to see a higher potential for stability and persistence relative to upland and non-riparian aspen stands. And so to do this, we have to compare between the riparian and aspen stands, primarily regeneration. If you don't have regeneration, you can't have stability. No babies, no parents, right? Next, we have to also take into consideration the level of conifer encroachment or other competitive shrub stand structure and composition, and then of course the relative browsing pressure between the two. So our sites are primarily in Idaho. Well, not primarily, they were completely in Idaho, being that I am a University of Idaho student. We went to some of the areas in southeastern Idaho of the Caribou Target National Forest, where they have the largest areas of aspen that I've seen in Idaho. And we compared 18 stands total, 9 riparian aspen stands paired with 9 upland aspen stands. All stands were at least a hectare in size, dominated by aspen based on basal area and relative frequency, and did not have any grazing exclusions, so keeping it natural. The upland sites were paired based on their ecoregion or subsection and proximity, as well as aspect, so the actual direction of sunlight. And just a quick data dump on you here for how we gathered our data that we needed. We used pretty standard forest inventory techniques, running transects through the stands. Along the transects, we had these 100-meter square plots every 15 to 25 meters, and then repeated the transects. Within the large plots, we counted the overstory stems, measured them, did the same at the regeneration level of all woody species. And then we divided the aspen regeneration into 2 height classes, sort of the seedling and sapling layer, and then also the recruitment layer. So anything under 1 meter was considered the seedling or sapling or relatively new regeneration. And then the over 1 meter was the recruitment layer that was soon to be adults. We counted ungulate droppings, kind of binned them all together as all as one set with cow, elk, moose, and deer, and use that to kind of as a proxy for relative browsing pressure. And then last, we looked at the actual ground cover layer of functional groups, graminoids, forbs, shrubs, fungi, and bryophytes, and then bare soil within these little microplots that we averaged for each plot. Okay, jumping right into our results. So we analyzed these with an NMDS. non-metric dimensional scaling for the regeneration layer. So this is all of the woody shrubs and competitive shrubs that we saw between the riparian zones and the upland zones. And we centered it on the aspen regeneration to see its effect. And we do see two distinct groups that were different significantly based on whether it was a riparian zone or an upland zone. So we're seeing a much higher variety of species growing in the riparian zones, and we're seeing a much different composition. In the canopy layer, so these are the dominant stems, we kind of saw that there is no significant difference, even though we do see higher variability in the riparian zone of the overstory species. From there, looking at just the ground cover layer, so graminoids, forbs, shrubs, overall the compositions were different between the two site types, riparian versus upland. We used an MRPP, so that's a multi-response permutation procedure, which is kind of like a fancy t-test, essentially. And the overall composition was different, but also the main groups, graminoids, forbs, and shrubs, were different between the two groups as well, with graminoids and forbs pretty much dominating in the riparian zones and shrubs dominating in the upland zones. But the percent cover wasn't different. So if you consider bare soil as the reciprocal of cover, we see that they're experiencing the same amount of cover of the ground floor layer, but what's there is different. Okay. From there, we have conifer encroachment. The conifer encroachment did not differ significantly between riparian or upland stands, but we did see a little bit of a trend higher in the upland versus the riparian zones at the dominant layer, so the highest strata of the canopy. We did not see, we saw actually a little bit higher in the understory layer, which is the overtop and intermediate size stems. But neither of these actually differed significantly. So we could say that conifer encroachment is relatively equal between the two groups. And if you excuse me a minute, I think I accidentally skipped a slide. Nope, I think it went missing out of here. Okay, sorry about that. What you don't see, a slide apparently got deleted, was the regeneration layer. We actually found significantly higher regeneration in the riparian zone at the seedling and sapling layer, but not in the recruitment layer, even though we saw a higher trend in the recruitment layer. So for our conclusions, our hypothesis is, do riparian zones provide an ecological context that promotes higher levels of regeneration? That part is supported. Yes, we do have higher levels of regeneration in the riparian zones, and this should lead to a higher, at least potential for persistence. Also not shown was that we saw no difference in relative browsing pressure. So it's not the browsing pressure that's driving these differences between the riparian zone and the upland zones. However, when we talk about stability, remember, stability is also affected by competition. While we saw a difference in the composition of the stands, we didn't see a difference in the level of conifer encroachment. This means that riparian aspen stands are still just as susceptible to conifer encroachment as upland stands are. But if you consider that as, yes, conifer encroachment is still important, but the regeneration is a little bit higher in the riparian zone. So based on what we wanted to discuss on moisture stress and regeneration, it does seem that riparian zones have a little bit better competitive edge when it comes to future stressors of increased temperatures and drought. And this makes sense kind of based on taken from an earlier study from Paul Rogers et al. In 2014, with kind of based on a Shinneman structure model of functional groups for aspen. They kind of put riparian zones in between stable and cereal, saying that they have kind of the potential to go either way. And that's kind of what we found here too, but we really kind of hammered in on the regeneration layer and said that, yeah, it can go either way, but that's really more driven by competition as opposed to a lack of regeneration. And so from there, we're going to kind of use this study as sort of a pilot study to look at a even bigger study where we're going to investigate these relationships, specifically of environmental and ecological factors. So we're going to kind of tease out the things that distinctly make or inherently make riparian zones different from upland zones. And some of those things are like topography and soil, elevation, and how those things drive competition and structure, which then drives regeneration. And we're going to do this with a path analysis or a structural equation model. And from there, just a quick plug of references that I used. And I will say thank you guys very much for hearing me bumble through. Sorry, I lost one of my slides somewhere in the transition. And also thank you to my PI, Charles Gable, who helped me put together this study.
There we go. My name's Keenan Rivers. This is some work I did for my master's thesis last year and the year before at SUNY ESF. Project's called Pattern and Process of Ground Layer Vegetation and Beech in Beech Bark Disease Aftermath Forests. My co-authors are John Drake, Stacy McNulty, and Julia Burton. So first, a little introduction about beech. Beech is a deciduous hardwood tree native to the eastern United States and southeastern Canada. And it has a pretty wide range, you can see on this map here, but most of its higher importance values, so where it has high basal area, high density, are in these northeastern hardwood forests, those green and blue values on the map there. And that is where it is most important. Beech is a shade-tolerant tree, which it makes it happier in kind of these later successional stands. Another important thing about it is that it regenerates readily via root sucker and stump sprout. So after stress or mortality, we're going to see dense stands of regeneration that are primarily clones. Yes, and those clones can persist in the understory for quite some time because beech is very shade tolerant. But one of the issues with beech is beech bark disease. So beech bark disease was introduced in the very late 1800s, early 1900s in Nova Scotia. It has moved south since then. It is not a single organism. It is a disease complex of scale insects, and there's a couple species there. I won't burden you with my pronunciations. And Nectria fungi, also a couple of species for them, some introduced, some native. And what happens is the scale insect, sucking insect, feeds on the within the vascular cambium of the tree, which creates these holes, and the Nectria fungi can invade, and they grow underneath the bark, essentially girdling the tree, killing the above ground portion of the tree. And like we talked about, the beech regenerates readily via root sucker after mortality. So the top killing of these trees related to the disease kind of generates these high densities of regeneration in forests affected by beech bark disease. There is a small portion of American beech that are resistant, fully resistant, and that number depends regionally and what study you look at, but that's somewhere between 1% to 5%. So a very small proportion is resistant, and then a greater proportion can be that's fully resistant, and a greater proportion can be highly resistant. So they get the disease, they are attacked by the insect and the Nectria fungi, but they are vigorous enough, or they have some genetic component which allows them to fight off the disease for the most part, and they can live quite some time showing signs of the disease. And this kind of variability in when trees get the disease and then when trees die from disease is something that's kind of confusing and can generate some complexity. So variability in mortality and resistance creates a mosaic of conditions within forests affected by beech bark disease. Beech within these northern hardwood forests initially was a very important species in the canopy, and after the initial killing front kills a vast majority of trees, we have these areas of highly dense regeneration, which are now growing up into canopy trees, and those trees get the disease. So we have this very complex mosaic of beech conditions within forest understories. So it leads to high densities of beech impacted. This has issues for canopy tree regeneration, as well as ground layer species diversity and richness for non-tree species. These dense understories shade out most other plants. other than extremely shade tolerant species. So conceptually thinking about how beech thickets, these dense regeneration areas, are influencing light resources, site and soil conditions, which will then influence the ground layer plant community, influencing spatial patterns. And we also want to think about how thicket structure and development will lead to these effects to the ground layer plant community, and how beech bark disease can vary within a stand. All right, so the broad objectives and hypotheses for the study were to assess patterns of beech structure in aftermath forests. And structure here, I mean the way that beech trees are using the three-dimensional space within the stand, and as a proxy for that, I use size classes, both of height and diameter. And my second objective is to quantify variability in the impacts of beech structure on the ground layer plant communities in forests affected by beech bark disease, so in these aftermath forests. So this was at SUNY ESF in New York. So we have two properties that we looked at that are owned by the university. One is in the central Adirondacks, that northernmost star there, Huntington Wildlife Forest, and one is on the Allegheny Plateau, a little further south in New York, Hyberg Memorial Forest. And these forests were both northern hardwood forests, primarily sugar maple canopies with mixtures of ash, yellow birch, very typical northern hardwoods. And they were similar in area. We have 30 to 40 hectares. They're similar in total basal area, 27 to 31. But the northernmost site, Huntington Forest there, has a much greater proportion of beech. So it's 30% beech by basal area and 61% beech by density. So that's showing us that we have this highly dense understory of beech, likely that's creating that 30% basal area and 61% density. Hyberg Forest is not devoid of beech, though. We do have 30% of the stems there of canopy trees over 10 centimeters are beech. So still quite a bit of beech there, just not the extreme levels that we see in our northern site there at Huntington Forest. This is kind of our plot setup for Huntington Forest site. So these are the plots. They're either on a grid of 40 meters from each other, and there's some in-between ones that are 20 meters from each other there. So this is that, I think this site is like 42 hectares, and that's how the canopy overstory plots are distributed within that site. And that's where we measured overstory trees. This is the southern site, Hyberg Forest, and it's just showing you the similar setup that we have there, although not identical in shape. Each of those dots on the previous map I showed represents one of these overstory plots, and within them we have these understory quadrats, which are 1 meter squared circular areas where we surveyed vegetation, everything below 1.4 meters. And we estimated cover for those. Additionally, we have some of the plots have a central quadrat, this one that's at the 2.5 meter distance from the next closest quadrat. And that was hopefully to capture from some fine scale spatial variation in the vegetation, which we can talk about later when we get to the results. But each of these small circles represents a vegetation quadrat that we surveyed. And they look like that, around flags, lots of fun, lots of species there. So methods, we kind of came at this from two directions based on our objectives. So our first objective was to assess patterns of beech structure in aftermath forests. We did that using NMS or NMDS ordination method. And what we fed to that were beech structural components. We had 10 total variables, 3 of which were live trees, 3 size classes, 10 to 15 centimeters, 15 to 25 centimeters, or greater than 25 centimeters. Snags we had in 3 classes, that's dead trees in the same diameter classes as that. And then understory beech trees We had 4 classes, so anything less than 30 centimeters was in the herb layer H. Between 30 and a meter were small shrub layer. Between a meter and 140 centimeters was tall shrubs, and anything that was less than 10 centimeters but more than 140 centimeters in height, we called a sapling or a medium sapling. Okay, and we analyzed the data individually per site. So each site got its own analysis, and then we can kind of compare the results that we got between them. So the first one we'll look at is the northern site, Huntington Wildlife Forest. And this is kind of the ordination results. Very exciting. We can enjoy that and look at what some of those variables mean. So all the variables on the top of this figure, or the positive second axis, the y-axis there, those are all our canopy variables. So our canopy trees in those 3 size classes, as well as the 3 size classes of snags. And then all the ones circled in blue on the negative y-axis there are our understory beach variables. So we see on the y-axis here, the exciting axis, in my opinion, we have this gradient from canopy beech trees to understory beech trees. So that these plots, each of these circles represents one of our plots. They're kind of organized in either understory dominated, where there's lots of, saplings or shrub layer beech trees that are growing up probably as a result of mortality in the canopy. And then we have other plots that aren't in that stage, unaffected by that are primarily, canopy large diameter trees. Our first axis there, the x-axis, kind of represents a gradient in beech density. So negative on that axis is going to be high beech density, positive is low beech density. That's negative positive thing. It's a little confusing, but that's how it came out. We can also look at the correlation. So this is the same ordination, but with different arrows, vectors representing correlations of some of our other variables. So forb cover, shrub cover, and tree cover were all significant for this ordination. You see that the cover of forbs is positively correlated with canopy beech. So plots that are more canopy beech than understory beech are going to have higher cover of forbs. And then shrubs and tree cover, so that's non-beech trees, are actually associated with higher beech density, not lower beech density, which kind of conflicts with what we would think that these high densities of vegetation are blocking out the other species. If we head south to our other site, Hyberg Memorial Forest, and we look at the same kind of thing. So we had the same input variables. We see kind of a similar gradient in structure, although we miss out on that x-axis density gradient. The x-axis here is kind of not as easily interpretable. But we do have kind of that same gradient of understory beech to canopy beech. It is switched directions this time. It might be a little confusing, but the positive is the understory beech and the negative is the canopy beech. So we still have that, despite the drastic difference in density between these 2 sites of beech, we still have this kind of structural organization that's occurring. And we can see that these, the overlap is not too significant between these variables, where all the understory ones are associated with each other, all the canopy ones are associated with each other.
1 minute.
Okay. And we can see that all of vegetation is associated with that positive direction, understory beech. That's exciting. Our second objective was to assess impacts of beech structure. And we looked at that through modeling. So we had a variety of models, and we were able to include the beech ordination axis scores as model components, so that gradient from overstory to understory beech within the models for each of our vegetation groups. And for those different vegetation groups, we checked 3 groups: forb cover, spring ephemeral cover, and shrub cover were significant, had significant effects from beech. And they were similar in their relationships, where understory beech had lower cover of vegetation. it's kind of backwards because the two sites have different directions. And that's our key results, which I just went over. And discussion. The relationship between beach and vegetation are very complex. It took me a long time to explain. These results suggest a nuanced goal-dependent approach for managing beach and aftermath forests, particularly at high densities. Associations between understory beach and other vegetation may complicate traditional management techniques. So in these understories where beach is growing densely, you may want to manage the beach with herbicide or mechanical removal, but you may also be removing your desirable understory species and canopy tree regeneration. All right, thank you. Any questions?
Well, thank you for having me here today, and I'll be presenting some work on changes in forest vegetation and bird communities over the past 10 years in the Toronto region related to two large-scale disturbance events. But before getting into the presentation, I want to acknowledge the co-authors who contributed to the work as well, and they are listed here. So we've all heard throughout this conference, and we all know that there's many types of disturbance in the environment. Disturbances can be both naturally occurring or anthropogenic in origin, but the results can sometimes be similar regardless of the source. Many ecosystems need this regular disturbance to function. However, it can also occur, as we know, in frequencies, intensities, or types that are not usual for a specific ecosystem, such as the influence of climate change. And ecological communities have varying abilities to resist the disturbance, as well as recover from that disturbance, known as their resiliency. So over the past 10 years in the Toronto region, there's been two major disturbances, including the December 2013 ice storm, as well as emerald ash borer. So in late December 2013, Eastern Canada was hit by a severe ice storm with freezing rain that lasted for 3 days, tree damage, especially in urban areas, power outages for thousands for more than a week, costing the City of Toronto more than $100 million. Also affecting our regional forests, EAB, which was first detected in North America in 2002, Southeast Michigan and Ontario, likely established much earlier, but it has moved through the Toronto region and a lot of Eastern and Central North America, destroying millions of trees. And so removal, replacement, and treatment by municipalities and homeowners are estimated to have cost about $1 billion in Canada alone. And so it's clear that both of these disturbances have had significant economic costs, but ecological implications for the forest are what we'll be presenting on today, using data collected through a long-term monitoring program. So the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, which I work for, or TRCA, is one of 36 conservation authorities in Ontario with the task of protecting and restoring the natural environment. And conservation authorities are established at a watershed scale in order to manage at a more ecologically representative unit, but it does overlap often multiple municipalities and their boundaries. TRCA's jurisdiction consists of about 9 watersheds covering an area of 3,500 square kilometers with about 35,000 hectares of forest, and also a population of 5 million people. And this leads to a kind of an urban to rural gradient based on the distance from Lake Ontario. Forests represent those of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence region, which most of you are familiar with, a mix of deciduous coniferous species. TRCA's terrestrial long-term monitoring program was established in 2008 to track regional changes in terrestrial ecosystems, including forests, related to natural heritage system objectives. And there's 24 forest vegetation plots and 29 forest bird monitoring stations across the jurisdiction and spanning this urban to rural gradient. So forest vegetation plots and bird stations are monitored every year using standard methods, including those endorsed by the once active EMAN protocols, the Ecological Monitoring and Assessment Network, and the Ontario Forest Bird Monitoring Protocols. Forest vegetation monitoring includes tree health, regeneration cover, stem counts, ground vegetation cover, as well as various species lists. We do both spring and summer surveys as well. And for the bird, the point counts, we counted all birds seen and heard within a 100-meter radius over 10 minutes, 2 surveys over the breeding season in appropriate weather conditions and really early, between 5 and 10 a.m. So the overall objective of this work is a lot different than some of the talks we've heard at this conference. And so we're in a more urban area, but we still do have, you know, forests. Some, they're all highly fragmented, but some are fairly large. And this wasn't really a specific research project. This more came out of the long-term monitoring program, whose goal is to look at temporal trends and spatial patterns and biodiversity across the jurisdiction. But through these analyses, it would appear that we captured both immediate impacts of 2 large-scale disturbances on the forest, along with post-disturbance changes and looking at the degree of recovery. So we have seen an increase in EAB since 2014. We only started monitoring it then and tracking it on our plots. There was a similar number of stems in urban and rural areas affected, although it was slightly higher in the urban plots. We did see a decrease in crown vigor followed by an increase. In general, the dominant and co-dominant trees in our area are generally healthy trees, but we did see that there was this kind of decrease and then an increase. So the darker gray bars are those that are in more decline. We also looked at changes in crown vigor for specific species in different years, and we did find some variation. And I want you to note that this graph is actually, the y-axis is inverted. So if you see increases, it actually means that the crown vigor was declining. So there was variation, but for several specific species highlighted here, like sugar maple, bur oak, and black cherry, there were declines in crown vigor in 2014 post ice storm, while for white ash, we saw declines in crown vigor that mostly started around 2018. We also saw increased ash mortality, which is expected, and those happened in years when we compare between years, starting mostly in 2015, and you can see the number of trees dying as well there. But the range kind of maxed out at about 1.5 to 3.1% mortality. And so this did result in a change in species composition, with white ash and red ash both decreasing in relative abundance. And as you might assume as well, we saw that the percentage of trees classified as snags increased over time. And we see that we mostly have about 89% or so of live trees, and then about 11% or so that are snags. And we also found that the presence of ash snags increased over time. So thinking about, you know, recovery and the future of forests, which we've also heard in some talks, due to this mortality, you know, crown opening the canopy, we did see several responses in the lower strata. So there wasn't any significant changes over time in terms of kind of a linear fashion, but we did find that the density, so the y-axis on the graph on the left is total stem count. So we did see this increase in the total amount of regeneration based on the number of stems, and this was most prevalent in the urban plots. And you can see that it increases around 2015 and then decreases again, but doesn't quite return to those pre-disturbance levels. And we didn't look at all species on a species-specific basis, but we did look at white ash, and we saw that there was a significant pattern. And you can see on the graph on the right, this increasing pattern of ash regeneration, either due to a stress response or the opening of the canopy. In addition to those regeneration level changes or layer changes, we also looked at the ground vegetation layer. And so this is more the very, very lowest strata. We found that we did see actually an increase in cover of exotic species. So this opening of the canopy and these changes is resulting in a change in kind of community, at least cover in this layer. So it looks like it started around 2015. And again, the similar pattern of that increase followed by some change, but again, not back to pre-2015 levels. And in addition to forest vegetation, we also found some indirect effects, including those on changes in bark foraging bird abundance over time. So those are the 4 species listed there that are considered to be bark foraging species based on work done by Flower et al. In 2014. And we did find a significant increase regionally in the total number of bark foragers across all stations. And so when we think about this, so we've captured the impacts of these large scale disturbances in our forest ecosystems, and we have the whole, chronological period of what's happened. But when we think about warming from climate change, there's projections in the Toronto region that do suggest there's warming. And as these continue to accelerate and the storm intensity increases, the future spread of pests and disease, we're hoping that these results can provide some insights into, how forests are going to be impacted, especially in these urban and peri-urban areas in the future, and think about what we can do about it. And so, more broadly, I think we need to think about how our science can inform climate change adaptation measures. And when we're in this more urban and peri-urban landscape, we can think about them from the perspectives of protection and restoration or enhancement. And so there's a few measures that we could consider, such as, striving to improve forest patch size. Also think about more early warning and identification systems for emerging pests and disease. Also invasive species management and prioritization. But also importantly, continued regional monitoring so that we can use this information to look at kind of these more broad scale regional impacts. And locally, we can implement these through various initiatives, including prioritizing where we restore habitat, natural heritage system planning, land securement, nature-based climate solutions, altering our forest management practices as well, and watershed planning as a way to assist our municipalities in landscape planning. So, but also what else? I'm really interested to hear perspectives from, I'm not a forest scientist, but I think perspectives from this group I would find quite valuable in how we can use, our science and what we're finding to think about how we can adapt to climate change. And I know the perspectives might be a bit different in this group than what I'm bringing forward, but I would really appreciate any of your feedback. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, please send me an email. We are also not a largely research-based organization, so if there's any interest in digging into, our huge data sets, I'd be more than happy to speak to you about that opportunity. So thank you.
So my name is Erin Hall. I'm a master's student at the University of Northern British Columbia in Dr. Che Elkin's lab. And today I'll be discussing our work to develop a framework to model vegetation dynamics following disturbance. And then I'll present some model results where we use this framework to explore the influence of disturbance on caribou winter range. I'm speaking to you from Smithers in Northwest British Columbia, Canada. And I'm situated on the Gittenden House territory within the Wet'suwet'en traditional territory. And my field study I'd like to acknowledge occurred across both Wet'suwet'en territory and Chishlada Carrier Nation territory. So as I mentioned, for this study, we developed a framework for modeling the stand scale response of winter range of the Tweedsmuir and Tiako caribou. So these are a herd of northern mountain caribou that's located in west central British Columbia. This purple circle here represents the area of their range. And their primary winter range is subboreal low elevation pine forests in these areas. Sorry, I need to breathe. This area has been subject to extensive disturbance over the last 25 years. So it was one area where the mountain pine beetle, the historic mountain pine beetle, started back in the late 90s, and that mountain pine beetle epidemic has spread across British Columbia and into Alberta. And then this resulted in this area of the death of almost all of the mature pine trees. Following that, there were large wildfires in 2014 and 2018 that burned nearly 500,000 hectares of forest. And that was extensively burnt the Tweeds, Marentiaco, Caribou winter range. It was focused in that area. And then there's been extensive timber harvest in the area as well in response to those disturbances. So biologists have identified that they need to understand how does the winter range develop and recover following this disturbance, and what are the best mechanisms for promoting the recovery of disturbance in a context of timber salvage harvest. We have models that model caribou habitat at the landscape scale, but there's large gaps in terms of at the stand scale, how do individual stands develop and the habitat features within those stands develop over time. So that's what we're working on here. Okay, for this caribou herd's winter range, they primarily rely upon terrestrial lichen for their winter diet. So that's the focus of value, one habitat feature of value. The second habitat feature that's important for caribou is actually low moose winter range value. So they select areas that have low densities of wolves. That's their primary defense strategy. We know that where there are moose, the wolves follow. So, and there's heightened mortality of caribou if this occurs within caribou habitat. This is termed apparent competition. So an important indicator of caribou winter range value is the intersection with poor moose habitat value. So we've identified 2 stand level habitat features related to moose habitat value: browse species that the moose favor, and conifer cover that provide for snow interception and thermal protection. So we know what habitat features are most important for caribou for their winter range. But when we're looking at a stand that's been highly disturbed, which stands still contain those habitat features? And if they don't because they've been disturbed, what stands and sites will in the future provide those habitat features? How long will it take for them to develop? And how long will they be sustained once they're developed within the stand? And then the overarching question then is, how do these features change as stands develop through succession and following different disturbances? So we have a model, SORTI-ND, that allows us to model stand structure. It's an individual tree complex stand dynamics model. Sorry, it's an individual tree spatially explicit model that allows us to model complex stand dynamics. So it models individual trees, their recruitment, their growth, and their mortality based upon the size of the tree, the species, their location, their light environment, and their competitive environment. And in addition, we can model snag dynamics, so we can model forest health disturbances as well. So this model provides information on the trees and the stand structure and the light environment as it changes over time in these stands. But how do we model the lichen and the moose fat features that are important within these stands? So we can develop linker functions that link the habitat features to specific stand characteristics. And if we can develop those, then we can predict from the output of the stand model, not only the stand features, but also how suitable the stand is to support lichen and moose habitat. So to do this, we did an extensive literature review and interviewed various subject experts and developed preliminary linker functions. And those linker functions informed the development of a field study where I sampled across gradients of stand type, stand age, and different site and a site gradient. And at each plot, we assessed site features, the stand structure, collected vegetation and lichen information, full data. And then we use this field data to inform the develop and refine our linker functions. So now we have linker functions that we can apply to our sortie output and use it to predict or project the suitability of the stand as it changes over time to support lichen and moose browse. I don't have time to go into the linker functions in detail, but these are the components of the linker functions. So for lichen, time since disturbance and light were both positively associated with lichen cover. Broadleaf content was negatively associated with lichen suitability. So broadleaf litter smothers the slow growing lichen. And edaphic condition is also important, where drier and poorer sites are better for lichen. For moose browse suitability, time since disturbance was also important. Conifer basal area was negatively associated with moose browse, as conifers compete with the moose browse for resources, and edaphic condition, where drier and poorer sites suppress browse. We also developed linker functions based on the density of subalpine fir and broadleaf saplings that are important for moose browse and conifer cover. We then used sortie to model 3 different disturbance scenarios. We modeled undisturbed mature stands starting at about 80 years of age. We modeled mountain pine beetle attack of these stands, and then clear cut of these sites and planting with representative species mix. We modeled 4 site types across the subboreal site gradient from subxeric to subhydric stands, with increasing richness associated with the increase in moisture. And we modeled 4 different stand types: pine leading stands, spruce leading stands, a mixed conifer stand with pine, spruce, and subalpine fir, and then a broadleaf conifer mix. So here we're getting into our modeling results. This panel presents the results of just the mature stand, growing the mature stand for another 200 years. The driest, poorest sites are at the top, and site productivity increases as you go down to the richest, wettest sites. Lichen suitability is along the y-axis, and it extends from 0 to 1, so it's a relative scale of suitability, where 1 is the highest cover of lichen that we'd expect to see in this region. And then the colors represent the different stand types. So the pink line is pine, the green line is a conifer mixed stand, and the yellow orangey line represents broadleaf stands. On these richer stands, there's also a purple line that represents the spruce. I think that's what we need to know for this. So as we walk through it, we see that edaphic site and stand type interact. So as you'd expect on your rich, wet sites, it doesn't matter what stand type you have, there's low suitability for lichen. But as sites become drier and poorer, there's a greater influence of stand type. You can see broadleaf stands are poor, provide poor suitability for lichen regardless of site productivity, but the pine stands increase in suitability over time. So now we're adding disturbance to this figure. The central panel represents mountain pine beetle attack stands, and on the right are the clear cut stands. And you can see that as we disturb the stand, both types of disturbance increase suitability for lichen. So suitability increases. Clear cutting elevates the suitability, but only for a short period of time until the canopy closes. And the length of time it takes for the canopy to close is reduced on richer sites, as you'd expect. Interestingly, the mountain pine beetle attacked stand that has the greatest suitability for lichen, and this extends for much longer than the increase in suitability that you see on clear cut stands. So it's almost 100 years before it becomes it has a similar suitability to the mature pine stand. And for moose browse results, we see a similar edaphic site and stand type interaction, although reversed. So on the dry, poor sites, there's less effective stand type, and they're generally just poorer than the rich sites in terms of moose browse. But we do see that the broadleaf stands have a consistently greater suitability for shrubs than the conifer mixed stands. And that's what I just spoke about just now. Okay, so mountain pine beetle, again, we're adding mountain pine beetle attack and clear cut to this figure. And here we see a reverse where the mountain pine beetle suppresses browse. So although there's an increase in suitability for browse and for lichen, or sorry, browse following disturbance, the mountain pine beetle attack stands have less suitability for moose browse than the clear cut stands. So from a caribou perspective, this is good, right? We have to remember that for caribou, we want to reduce the suitability for moose so that we reduce the likelihood of wolves on the landscape. And again, time interacts with site. So we see that with richer site, there's a reduced time frame for moose browse availability on or suitability on the landscape. And I'm at 13 minutes, so I don't have much time for the moose cover results, except to say that, again, there's an edaphic effect and the richer sites recover.
Oh, you have an extra minute, actually, so just don't go for it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So yes, the richer sites, the time that it takes for the cover to recover is quicker than on your poorer sites, as you'd expect. The stands grow much slower on the poorer sites. Interestingly, in the mountain pine beetle sites, you see much more variability in the cover, the suitability of the stands to provide cover. And these hardwood stands you can't see on this figure. My other figures have quantiles that show more of the within stand variability, but there's a lot more variability within stands and the broadleaf stands than in the other stand types. And especially more variability than the clear cut stands. So for take home messages at a stand scale, if we're managing at a stand scale to promote caribou winter range recovery, then we should avoid salvage on the sub-xeric mountain pine beetle attack stands, because the mountain pine beetle attack itself will extend the conditions that are suitable for lichen for quite a significant length of time. We should also avoid clear-cut harvest on richer and wetter sites and sites with a broadleaf component to minimize moose browse. And on this landscape, these sites are intermixed quite intimately. So there's extensive dry sites, but there are also these richer, wetter sites intermixed. So on those areas, we should avoid clear-cut harvest. And if harvest does occur, we should consider harvest patterns that mimic mountain pine beetle conditions, such as uniform partial harvest. And that's a little bit of a sneak preview, I guess. Stay tuned. The second component of my project is modeling partial cutting and various different partial cutting strategies and assessing their impact on vegetation dynamics. And then the other strategy would be to minimize regeneration of broadleaf trees. So in conclusion, site, stand type, disturbance history, and silviculture system options should all be considered when we're managing for habitat features on a landscape. So I'd like to acknowledge my committee, additional contributors to the project, and my funding sources. And with that, be happy to hear any questions and discussion. And if I don't know how much time we have now, but if we have more time, or please feel free to get in touch or find me later as well.